The email notification hit my phone at 3:47 a.m. Dublin time. Bank of America. Large transaction alert. My heart stopped when I saw the amount. $250,000. From the sale of my house. The house I never agreed to sell. The house my brother David had just stolen from me while I was 5,000 miles away, thinking I could trust family. But here's the thing about betrayal. Sometimes it reveals exactly who someone really is. And sometimes, if you're smart enough to see the signs early, you can be 3 steps ahead when they finally show their true colors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Emma, and 2 years ago, I thought losing my grandmother was the worst thing that could happen to our family. I was wrong. The worst thing was discovering that the brother I'd protected and supported my entire life was willing to destroy everything she left behind the moment I stepped out of the country. The morning started like every other Tuesday in our childhood, home in Pasadena. Mom was fluttering around the kitchen, reorganizing spice racks that didn't need reorganizing, while Dad read the sports section with his usual commentary about how the Dodgers were managed by people who clearly never played baseball. The smell of her famous blueberry pancakes filled the air. The same recipe she'd been making since David and I were kids, fighting over who got the last one. David sat across from me, cutting his stack into perfect squares the way he always did, while Michelle fed baby food to 6-year-old Sophia, who kept insisting she was too old for help, but clearly wasn't managing the spoon on her own. 8-year-old Tyler was building elaborate syrup patterns on his plate, creating what he called pancake art that was really just an excuse to use half the bottle. It was Michelle who brought it up first, her voice carrying that practiced casualness that always meant she'd rehearsed the conversation beforehand. Emma, you know David's been looking at that tech position in San Francisco, the one with the startup. Really good opportunity, but the thing is, they want him to start next month. I glanced up from my phone where I'd been reviewing emails from the Dublin consulting firm. The 6-month contract offer was exactly what I'd been hoping for, a chance to work with European clients on sustainable technology implementation, the kind of project that could establish my reputation internationally and set up my consulting business for years to come. That's great news, I said, genuinely happy for him. David had been struggling since losing his sales position at the medical device company. 6 months of unemployment had been rough on their family, especially with 2 kids and a mortgage, on their cramped apartment in downtown LA. David smiled, but there was something strained around his eyes. Yeah, well, the thing is, the pay is good, but not great to start. And moving costs, first month's rent, security deposit for a place, big enough for all of us. It's going to be tight. Mom immediately jumped in, her maternal instincts kicking into overdrive. Oh, honey, your father and I could help with some of the moving expenses. We've got some savings set aside. No, Mom, David said quickly, holding up his hand. You and Dad have done enough. This is something Michelle and I need to handle ourselves. I watched this exchange with growing understanding. There was a choreography to it, a careful dance they'd planned. Michelle's casual mention, David's modest response, Mom's predictable offer, his noble refusal. All of it leading somewhere specific. The real issue, Michelle continued, picking up her cue perfectly, is that we'd need something more substantial. Like a loan, but not from family. Something we could get approved for quickly. David nodded, still focused on his pancake squares. I've been thinking about it all week. We could probably get a personal loan, but the interest rates are brutal. Right now. Or we could look into a business loan for when I eventually start my own consulting firm, but that's complicated and takes forever. Tyler looked up from his syrup art. Are we moving to San Francisco, Daddy? Can I bring my bike? We're still figuring it out, buddy, David said, ruffling his son's hair. Sophia chimed in. Will we live near the Golden Gate Bridge? My teacher showed us pictures. The conversation continued around the children's questions, but I could feel the undercurrent building. This wasn't just family breakfast chatter. This was a setup, and I was starting to recognize the pattern. "You know," Dad said, folding his newspaper and joining the conversation properly for the first time. "Emma's always been good with financial planning. Maybe she has some ideas." All eyes turned to me. There it was. The moment they'd been building toward. I set down my fork and looked around the table at faces I'd known my entire life. My brother, who used to build blanket forts with me and share his Halloween candy. My sister-in-law, who'd become like the sister I never had. My parents, who'd raised us to believe family came first, always. "What kind of ideas are you thinking?" I asked carefully. Michelle and David exchanged a glance. "Well," Michelle said, "you've got that inheritance from Grandma Rose, the house in Riverside. It's just sitting there empty while you're thinking about what to do with it." The house, of course. Grandma Rose's little 2-bedroom cottage with the wraparound porch and the garden she'd spent 40 years perfecting. The place where David and I had spent every summer, learning to grow tomatoes and catching fireflies in mason jars. The house she'd left to me specifically, with a handwritten note that said she knew I'd take care of it the way she had. "I haven't decided what I'm doing with the house yet," I said slowly. "Of course not," David said quickly. "And we're not asking you to decide anything permanent. But the thing is, it's just sitting there, and we're in this temporary bind. What if we worked out some kind of arrangement?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Like, we could use it as collateral for a loan, or maybe even a short-term rental situation. Just until I get established in San Francisco and we can get our own place. Mom beamed like this was the most brilliant solution ever conceived. "Oh, that's perfect. It would be wonderful to have the house lived in again. Grandma Rose always said homes need families in them to stay happy." I felt something cold settle in my chest, but it wasn't anger. It was recognition. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation over breakfast. This was a carefully planned presentation, complete with emotional appeals and practical solutions. They'd discussed this beforehand, probably multiple times, working out the best approach to get me to agree. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. David leaned forward, his voice gaining confidence now that the topic was out in the open. "Here's what I'm thinking. You let us move into the house temporarily. 6 months, maybe a year at most. We take care of all the maintenance, keep the garden up, make sure everything stays in good condition. In exchange, we use the house as collateral for a business loan that I'll need anyway for consulting work. It's a win-win. The house gets cared for, we get the financial backing we need, and you don't have to worry about property management while you're focusing on your career. Plus," Michelle added, "the kids would love growing up in that garden. Sophia's been asking about planting flowers, and Tyler would have space to ride his bike safely. The children. Of course they'd bring the children into it. Tyler's eager face, Sophia's innocent excitement about flowers. How could anyone say no to giving children a safe place to play?" "It would only be temporary," David emphasized, "just until we get on our feet." I looked around the table again. 4 adults and 2 children, all watching me with varying degrees of expectation. This was my family. These were people who'd celebrated my successes, supported me through difficulties, shared holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday mornings just like this one. But sitting there, watching their faces, I realized something uncomfortable. They hadn't asked me about my plans. They hadn't inquired about the Dublin opportunity I'd been considering, the one that could change my entire career trajectory. They hadn't wondered if I might have my own uses for Grandma Rose's house, my own timeline for making decisions about it. They'd simply assumed that my inheritance, my opportunity, my future, was available for their immediate needs. "When would you Need an answer? I asked. Well, David said, ideally pretty soon. The San Francisco position starts in 4 weeks. And if we're going to make this work, we'd need to get the loan process started and coordinate the move. 4 weeks. 4 weeks to decide the fate of the most significant thing my grandmother had left me. 4 weeks to potentially change the entire trajectory of multiple lives, including my own. I need to think about it, I said. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a family enjoying breakfast together, but the strained quiet of people who'd expected a different response. Of course, Mom said quickly. Of course you need to think about it. It's a big decision. But not too long, hopefully, Michelle added with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Time-sensitive and all. I nodded and went back to my pancakes. But the sweetness had gone out of them. The conversation moved on to other topics. Tyler's upcoming soccer game, Sophia's school art project, Dad's plans to finally fix the squeaky gate in their backyard. Normal family chatter that felt suddenly hollow. As I sat there, half listening to discussions about carpool schedules and weekend plans, I found myself thinking about Grandma Rose. About the last conversation we'd had before she passed, when she'd taken my hand in her paper-thin fingers and told me she was leaving me the house because she knew I understood what it meant to build something slowly, carefully, with intention. Don't let anyone rush you into decisions about it, she'd said. Houses have their own timing, just like people. Looking around the breakfast table, watching my family continue their cheerful planning around my potential agreement, I wondered if Grandma Rose had known something I was just beginning to understand. That sometimes the people who love you most are also the ones most willing to assume your love means automatic availability. After breakfast, I helped Mom clear the dishes while David and Michelle corralled the kids for the drive back to their apartment. As I loaded plates into the dishwasher, Mom came up beside me, her voice carefully casual. You know, sweetheart, David really has been struggling since he lost that job, and Michelle's been working so hard. But with 2 little ones, it's difficult for her to take on more hours. I kept loading dishes, not trusting myself to respond immediately. I know Grandma Rose left you that house for a reason, Mom continued. She always said you had the best judgment in the family. But I also think she'd want it to help the family when it could, don't you? There it was, the gentle manipulation, wrapped in wisdom and family loyalty. The suggestion that saying no would somehow dishonor my grandmother's memory, despite the fact that she'd left the house specifically to me. I'm sure she would want what's best for everyone, I said carefully. Exactly. Mom squeezed my shoulder. I know you'll make the right choice. As I drove home to my apartment that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been maneuvered into a corner I hadn't seen coming. The Dublin opportunity was still sitting in my email inbox, waiting for a response. 6 months in. Ireland, working with international clients, building the kind of experience that could establish my consulting business globally. But now there was this, my brother's need, my family's expectations, and a house that had become the center of everyone's plans except my own. That evening, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and my laptop, looking at the Dublin contract details for the dozenth time. The position was perfect. The timing was ideal. The money was good, and the experience would be invaluable. But accepting, it would mean being out of the country during the exact time frame when David needed access to the house. It would mean making a decision that prioritized my future over his immediate crisis. As I sat there, watching the sunset paint the sky, in shades of orange and pink, I realized I was facing more than just a practical decision about property and loans and family logistics. I was facing a fundamental question about what I owed the people I loved and what I owed myself. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Hey Em, been thinking about this morning. I know it's a lot to consider. Just want you to know how much it would mean to us. Michelle's already looking at schools in San Francisco for the kids, and they're so excited about the possibility of having a yard to play in. Thanks for being willing to think about it. You're the best sister a guy could ask for." I stared at the message for a long time. There was affection in it, genuine gratitude and family love. But there was also pressure, subtle and effective. Michelle looking at schools, kids excited about yards, the implication that saying no would be disappointing children who were already building dreams around my potential generosity. I set the phone aside without responding and went back to the Dublin contract. 6 months. Sustainable technology, consulting, international experience, the opportunity to build something of my own, separate from family obligations and expectations. As I read through the details again, I found myself thinking about something Grandma Rose used to say when she was teaching me to garden. "Plants need their own space to grow, Emma. You can't just crowd everything together because it seems more efficient. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give something room to become what it's meant to be." That night, I made 2 decisions. I signed the Dublin contract and emailed it back to the consulting firm. And I called my bank to ask about adding additional security measures to my accounts, particularly any that might be connected to property or family financial matters. I didn't know yet that I was going to need those precautions. I just knew that something about the morning's conversation had left me feeling like I needed to protect something I couldn't quite name. 3 weeks later, I was boarding a plane to Dublin, leaving behind a family who thought they knew exactly what I was going to do with my grandmother's house. They were wrong about that, but they weren't wrong about their own intentions. I just didn't know it yet. Dublin felt like stepping into a different version of myself. The consulting firm had arranged temporary housing in a converted Georgian townhouse near Trinity College, with tall windows that let in the soft Irish light and a kitchenette where I could make proper tea while reviewing client proposals. My days were filled with meetings about renewable energy infrastructure and sustainable urban planning, the kind of work that felt purposeful and challenging in ways I hadn't experienced before. The time difference worked in my favor, allowing me to tackle European business hours while most of my family back home was still sleeping. By the time evening settled over Dublin, it was barely afternoon in California, which meant I could handle any personal matters without interrupting my workflow. It was a rhythm that felt sustainable, professional, and entirely my own. 3 days into my stay, David called. The enthusiasm in his voice was infectious as he described his first week. At the San Francisco startup, the office culture was exactly what he'd hoped for, collaborative and innovative, with the kind of energy that made going to work feel less like obligation and more like opportunity. Michelle had found a promising preschool for Sophia and an elementary school for Tyler that specialized in science and technology programs. "Everything's falling into place," he told me, his voice crackling slightly through the international connection. "The only thing left is getting the financial side sorted out. Have you had a chance to think more about the house situation?" I was standing at my apartment window, watching students cross the cobblestone courtyard below. The question hung in the air between us, carried across thousands of miles of ocean and expectation. "I'm still considering it," I said carefully. "I totally understand. It's a big decision. But Emma, if this works out, it would solve everything. The loan officer says they'd need to start the paperwork soon if we want to close before I lose this opportunity." There was urgency in his voice now, the kind that suggested time was running shorter than I'd realized. "How soon is soon?" "Ideally, by the end of next week." I know that sounds rushed, but the housing market in San Francisco is brutal. If we don't move fast, we'll lose out on the good places and end up paying twice as much for half the space. I found myself nodding even, though he couldn't see me. The practical part of his argument made sense. Housing markets didn't wait for convenient family timing, and opportunities in competitive cities had their own unforgiving schedules. "The thing is," David continued, "Michelle and I were talking, and we realized we could probably handle most of the loan paperwork ourselves. You wouldn't need to be involved in much of the day-to-day stuff. We'd just need your signature on a few documents, maybe a power of attorney form so we could handle things while you're abroad. Power of attorney. The phrase settled strangely in my mind. It sounded official and temporary, but also broader than what we'd originally discussed. What exactly would that cover? Oh, just the basics. Property management stuff, loan negotiations, maybe some maintenance decisions if anything urgent came up with the house. Nothing major. Just enough authority to keep things moving smoothly while you're focused on your consulting work. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about it felt too neat, too convenient. I'd seen enough business negotiations to recognize when someone was making complex legal arrangements sound simpler than they actually were. I'd want to review any documents before signing them, I said. Of course. Absolutely. I'll have the lawyer draft everything and send copies to your email. Take all the time you need to look them over. After the call ended, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the evening light fade over Dublin's ancient architecture. The conversation had shifted something. What started as a temporary housing arrangement was becoming a formal legal relationship involving loans and property rights and power of attorney documents. 2 days later, the documents arrived in my email inbox. 3 PDF files with official letterheads and legal terminology. That took me the better part of an evening to work through. The power of attorney form was broader than I'd expected, granting David authority not just over property decisions, but over financial matters related to the house, including the ability to refinance, restructure loans, or make changes to ownership. Documentation is needed for loan purposes. The language was dense and filled with legal qualifications, but the practical effect was clear. David would have the authority to make significant financial decisions about my property without requiring my direct approval for each action. I printed the documents and spread them across the small dining table in my Dublin apartment, reading through each section carefully. There were provisions for loan restructuring, property management, financial negotiations, and something called asset optimization for debt consolidation purposes that I didn't fully understand. The next morning, I called a law office in downtown Dublin that specialized in international property law. The solicitor I spoke with was helpful and thorough, explaining that power of attorney documents varied significantly depending on their scope and the specific authority they granted. The document you've described sounds quite comprehensive, she told me during our phone consultation. Such arrangements can be perfectly legitimate for family property management, but they do carry significant legal implications. I'd recommend having an independent solicitor review the specific language before you sign. That afternoon, I forwarded the documents to a law firm in Los Angeles that a colleague had recommended. Their response came back within 24 hours, pointing out several areas where the language was broader than typical property management agreements. They suggested modifications that would limit the scope of authority to specific, temporary actions rather than general financial decision-making. When I called David to discuss these concerns, his reaction was immediate and reassuring. "Emma, I totally understand wanting to be careful. That's just smart business thinking. The lawyer probably used standard language that covers more than we actually need. We can definitely modify anything that makes you uncomfortable." His willingness to adjust the documents eased some of my concerns. This was David, my brother who used to share his lunch money with me when I forgot mine, who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra homework. If there were legal technicalities that seemed overly broad, it was probably just standard lawyer covering all bases language, rather than any intentional overreach. "Why don't you send me a list of the specific changes you'd want?" he suggested, "and I'll have our lawyer revise everything. We want this to work for everyone." Over the next week, I worked with the Dublin solicitor to draft a more limited version of the power of attorney, one that specifically restricted David's authority to temporary property management and loan negotiations directly related to their housing needs. The revised document included clear time limits, specific scope restrictions, and required my written approval for any major financial decisions. David's response to these modifications was enthusiastic. "This looks perfect," he emailed back. "Much clearer than the original version. I'll get the revised documents prepared and overnighted to you for signature." The speed with which he agreed to the restrictions should have reassured me completely. Instead, it left me with a nagging feeling that I couldn't quite identify. People who were planning to abuse legal authority typically didn't agree so readily to limitations on that authority. But people planning legitimate temporary arrangements did exactly what David was doing, accommodating reasonable concerns and working collaboratively to find solutions that worked for everyone involved. The documents arrived by international courier on a Thursday morning. They looked professional and official, printed on legal letterhead with notary spaces and witness signature lines. The language matched the modifications I'd requested, with clear limitations on scope and timeline. I signed them at the American Embassy in Dublin, with proper notarization and witness documentation. By Thursday afternoon, they were on their way back to California, where David would file them with the appropriate legal offices and begin the loan application process. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at a restaurant near the Liffey River, celebrating what felt like a successful resolution to a complicated family situation. I'd found a way to help David without compromising my own interests, maintained appropriate legal protections, and kept family relationships intact while pursuing my own career opportunities in Dublin. The consulting work was going better than I'd hoped. My clients were engaged and collaborative, the projects were innovative and meaningful, and I was building exactly the kind of international experience that would establish my reputation for years to come. The Dublin firm had already hinted at the possibility of extending my contract or bringing me back for future projects. For the first time in months, I felt like I was building a life that balanced family responsibilities with personal ambitions. I'd found a way to support David's opportunity without sacrificing my own, maintained the family relationships that mattered to me, and proven to myself that I could navigate complex international business situations with confidence and competence. 3 weeks later, everything changed. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my Dublin apartment when my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank's mobile app. Large transaction alert. My heart rate picked up as I opened the notification, expecting to see a charge related to my Dublin expenses or perhaps some automatic payment I'd forgotten about. Instead, I saw a pending deposit for $250,000. The transaction description read, "Property sale proceeds. 1247 Rose Garden Way, Riverside, CA. My grandmother's house, my house, had been sold." I stared at the screen, reading the transaction details over and over, certain there had to be some mistake. The house wasn't for sale. I hadn't listed it with any real estate agent. I hadn't signed any sale agreements or closing documents. But the bank transaction was real, and the address was unmistakably correct. With shaking hands, I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account from the website, hoping the mobile app had somehow displayed incorrect information. But there it was, confirmed in the official transaction history. A deposit of $250,000 from the key, sale of property I had never agreed to sell. I called the bank immediately, despite the early hour in California. The customer service representative was helpful, but limited in what information she could provide over an international call. The transaction had been processed legitimately, with proper documentation and authorization. The sale had been completed through established legal channels with all required signatures and approvals. "But I didn't authorize any sale," I told her, my voice rising despite my attempts to stay calm. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but our records show that the transaction was processed through a valid power of attorney arrangement. All the documentation appears to be in order." Power of attorney. The documents I'd signed 3 weeks earlier, the ones David had said were just for temporary property management and loan negotiations. I asked the representative to email me, copies of all the authorization documents used for the sale. They arrived in my inbox 20 minutes later, and as I read through them, the truth became clear with horrible, precise clarity. The power of attorney I'd signed, despite the modifications I'd thought I was making, had included language that authorized property sale under certain circumstances. The legal terminology was complex and buried in subsections, but the effect was unambiguous. David had been granted the authority to sell my house. The sale had been completed 2 days earlier. The closing documents showed that the property had been listed, marketed, and sold within a 3-week period while I was thousands of miles away, focused on my consulting work and trusting that my family was handling a simple loan arrangement. The real estate documents showed a sale price of $250,000, which was significantly below the property's actual market value. A quick search of comparable properties in the Riverside area suggested the house should have sold for at least $300,000, possibly more given its condition and location. But a below-market sale would have been easier to complete quickly, with fewer complications and faster closing timelines. Someone who wanted to sell property without the owner's active involvement would have every incentive to price it for quick movement rather than maximum value. I called David immediately, despite the time difference that meant I was waking him up at 5 a.m. California time. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice groggy and confused. "Emma, what's wrong? Is everything okay?" "David, I just got a bank notification. The house was sold. Grandma Rose's house was sold." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was more alert, but carefully controlled. "Oh, yeah. I was going to call you about that today. There was an issue with the loan application. The bank said they needed more collateral than we originally thought, and the fastest way to resolve it was to convert the property to cash assets. You sold my house without telling me." "Emma, I know how this looks, but it was the only option. The San Francisco housing market moved faster than we expected, and we were about to lose the place we wanted. The loan officer said we could either find additional collateral or convert existing assets to cash. This was the cleanest solution." "You sold my house," I repeated, because the other words he was saying seemed to be sliding past the central, unacceptable fact. "I know it's not what we originally planned, but think about it from a practical standpoint. You weren't using the house, and this way you have liquid assets instead of property you have to maintain and manage from overseas. It's actually a better situation for you financially. That wasn't your decision to make. Emma, I had the legal authority to make that decision. You signed the power of attorney." The lawyer explained everything. This was all above board and legitimate. The calm reasonableness in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. He was explaining this as if it were a logical business decision rather than a betrayal of trust and violation of family loyalty. "Where's the money?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "I see $250,000 deposited in my account. But you said this was about getting loan collateral for your house purchase. So where's my money going?" Another pause. "Well, that's what we need to discuss. The loan structure requires the funds to be held in a specific type of account for a certain period. It's a temporary arrangement, but it might take a few months to get everything sorted out and transfer the money back to your personal accounts." "Transfer what money back? It's my money from my house." "Of course it's your money, Emma. Nobody's suggesting otherwise. But you have to understand, this whole arrangement was designed to help all of us. You get liquid assets instead of property, maintenance, we get the collateral we need for our loan, and everybody benefits. I never agreed to sell the house, David. You agreed to let me handle the financial arrangements. That's what the power of attorney was for. The power of attorney was supposed to be limited to loan negotiations. Emma, I think maybe you didn't fully understand what you were signing. Property sales are sometimes necessary for loan negotiations. The lawyer explained all of this. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became clear that David had an answer. For every objection I raised, The sale was legal because of the power of attorney. The below-market price was necessary for quick closing. The complex financial arrangements were standard for large asset-based loans. My lack of direct consultation was unfortunate, but not required given the legal authority I'd granted. Everything he said was technically defensible, legally sound, and completely beside the point. When I hung up, I sat in my Dublin apartment staring at the bank statement on my laptop screen. $250,000 from the sale of my grandmother's house, money that was legally mine but practically inaccessible, tied up in loan arrangements I didn't understand for a family home purchase I'd never agreed to fund. But as I sat there, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened, I realized something David didn't know. 3 days before signing the power of attorney documents, I'd done something he wasn't aware of. Something that had seemed like simple financial prudence at the time, but was about to become much more significant. I'd moved money. A lot of money. From accounts David had access to, into accounts he didn't even know existed. David thought he was the only one in our family capable of making strategic financial moves without full family consultation. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The realization hit me as I sat in a small cafe near Dublin Castle, staring at my laptop screen while rain drummed against the windows. David had no idea what he'd actually done. He thought he'd executed a clever financial maneuver, using legal documentation to access my property while I was conveniently thousands of miles away. What he didn't understand was that I'd been watching, learning, and preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal for longer than he realized. It hadn't started with suspicion. It had started with simple financial responsibility. When Grandma Rose left me the house, she'd also left me her bank accounts, investment portfolios, and life insurance policy. The total inheritance was substantial, far more than just the property value. Over the past 2 years, I'd been managing these assets carefully, working with financial advisors to diversify investments and optimize tax implications. 6 months ago, when David first started having employment troubles, I'd noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Small things at first. He'd ask detailed questions about my financial situation under the guise of brotherly concern. He'd offer unsolicited advice about investment strategies, or suggest we should coordinate our financial planning since we were both single professionals without major family obligations. Then Michelle started making comments about how responsible I was with money, how David always said I was the smart one when it came to financial decisions. There were casual mentions of his difficulty getting approved for loans, suggestions that family members with good credit might be able to help in various ways. The conversations were always friendly, supportive, framed as family looking out for each other. But they followed a pattern that made me increasingly uneasy. They were gathering information about my financial resources while establishing a narrative about family mutual support. 3 weeks before I left for Dublin, I'd made a decision that seemed like simple prudence at the time. I moved the majority of my liquid assets from accounts David knew about into new accounts at different financial institutions. The old accounts remained open with minimal balances, enough to handle routine expenses and maintain the appearance of normal financial activity. The new accounts were held at banks David had never heard me mention, with different contact information and additional security protocols. They contained the bulk of my inheritance money, investment proceeds, and savings accumulated over years of careful financial management. David knew I had money. He'd helped me move some of Grandma Rose's financial documents after her death, and he'd been present during conversations with the estate lawyer about the inheritance. But he didn't know exactly how much money, where it was held, or how it was structured. More importantly, he didn't know that I'd moved it. The power of attorney documents he'd used to sell my house gave him access to property decisions, and the bank accounts specifically mentioned in the legal paperwork. Those accounts now contained the proceeds from the house sale, which he was planning to use as collateral for his business ventures. What he didn't realize was that those accounts represented a fraction of my actual financial resources. While David thought he was positioning himself to control my most significant assets, he was actually positioning himself to control assets I deliberately isolated for exactly this possibility. The house sale money was substantial, but it wasn't my primary financial security. It was the amount I could afford to lose if family relationships went badly wrong. And they had definitely gone badly wrong. I spent the afternoon in my Dublin apartment, making secure phone calls to financial institutions across 3 time zones. My investment advisor in Los Angeles confirmed that all my primary accounts remained untouched and secure. My bank in Ireland verified that my consulting income was being deposited correctly into accounts David had no knowledge of or access to. Most importantly, I called the financial firm that managed my grandmother's trust fund, an account David didn't know existed. Grandma Rose had been more financially sophisticated than anyone in our family realized. The house was just the visible part of her estate. The real wealth was in carefully structured investments that had been growing quietly for decades. The trust fund was substantial enough to purchase several houses like the one David had just sold. It was managed by professionals who'd known my grandmother for 20 years and had explicit instructions about how the money should be handled. David's financial maneuvering hadn't touched this account because he didn't know it existed. By evening, I had a complete picture of my financial situation. David had taken control of approximately 30% of my liquid assets. He thought he'd taken control of everything I had. The difference between those two realities was about to become very significant. But I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed to understand exactly what David was planning to do with the money he'd taken, and I needed to document everything carefully. If this situation was going to escalate into legal territory, I wanted comprehensive records of every transaction, every conversation, and every false statement he'd made. The next morning, I called Michelle. Not David, but Michelle, because I wanted to hear her version of events before she had time to coordinate her story with her husband's explanation. Emma. Her voice was bright and cheerful when she answered. How's Dublin? David said you two talked about the house situation. I hope you're not too upset about the change in plans. I know it probably feels sudden from your perspective. I'm trying to understand what happened, I said carefully. David mentioned something about loan complications? Oh, it was such a mess. You know how banks are with their constantly changing requirements. We thought we had everything figured out, and then suddenly they wanted different types of collateral, different documentation, different everything. David was so stressed about possibly losing the San Francisco opportunity. Her explanation sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this version of events. When did you find out the house was being sold? Well, David kept me updated throughout the process. He was being so careful to make sure everything was handled properly, getting legal advice, making sure all the documentation was correct. I think he was planning to call you earlier, but with the time difference and your work schedule, it was hard to find a good time. Michelle, the house sold 2 days ago. I found out this morning through a bank alert. There was a pause. Oh, I thought he'd already talked to you about it. He's been so busy with the move and everything. I'm sure he was planning to call you today. Has the money been transferred yet? For your house purchase? That's all being handled by the lawyers in the bank. David takes care of all the financial stuff. I just focus on getting the kids ready for the move and finding schools and doctors and all that family logistics. Michelle's responses told me something important. Either she genuinely didn't understand the financial details of what David was doing, or she was deliberately maintaining plausible deniability about the more questionable aspects of the arrangement. After the call, I spent several hours researching property records and loan documentation online. It didn't take long to find information about David and Michelle's house purchase in San Francisco. The property was expensive, nearly twice what they could afford on David's new salary, even with 2 incomes. But the loan documents, which were public record, showed something interesting. The loan was structured as a business investment rather than a traditional home mortgage. David wasn't just buying a family home. He was purchasing a property for short-term rental income, planning to rent out rooms to offset the mortgage payments. This wasn't a desperate family trying to find stable housing. This was an investment strategy, using my house sale as collateral, to purchase rental property that would generate ongoing income. David hadn't told me this part of the plan. He'd presented the situation as a family in crisis needing temporary help with housing. The reality was a calculated business venture, using my assets as startup capital. Over the next week, I continued my research while maintaining my normal consulting work in Dublin. The San Francisco property purchase was part of a larger financial strategy David had been developing. He'd incorporated a small business, registered for short-term rental permits, and was planning to purchase additional properties using the rental income and accumulated equity. My house sale wasn't helping. A family in crisis. It was funding the initial phase of David's real estate investment business. The more I learned, the clearer it became that this wasn't a desperate decision made under pressure. It was a planned strategy that David had been developing for months, possibly longer. The timing of his job loss, the San Francisco opportunity, the urgent need for family assistance, all of it had been choreographed to create circumstances where I would feel obligated to help. But he'd made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed that taking my house sale money would effectively control my financial options. He'd calculated that I would be forced to go along with his business venture because I needed access to the money he was controlling. He had no idea that the money he'd taken was money I could afford to lose. On a rainy Thursday evening in Dublin, I made my decision. David wanted to play financial games with family assets. He thought he understood money and leverage and strategic advantage. He was about to discover that understanding financial strategy required knowing all the relevant information, and there was a lot he didn't know. I started with the accounts he thought he was controlling. The house sale proceeds were sitting in an account that was linked to other financial products David had access to through the power of attorney documents. He was planning to use these funds as collateral for business loans, investment property purchases, and ongoing operational expenses for his rental business. But those accounts had features David wasn't aware of. Automatic transfer protocols, security triggers, and account monitoring systems that activated when certain transaction patterns were detected. I'd set up these features months ago as protection against exactly this kind of situation. If someone other than me attempted to move large amounts of money from these accounts, the transfers would be flagged for additional verification. If multiple large transactions occurred within a short time frame, the accounts would automatically freeze pending identity confirmation. David's first mistake was moving too much money too quickly. His business venture required immediate access to large amounts of cash for property deposits, business registration fees, and operational startup costs. He'd been making substantial withdrawals and transfers over the past week, triggering every security protocol I'd established. His second mistake was not understanding that power of attorney documentation had limits. He could authorize property, sales, and basic financial transactions, but he couldn't override security protocols or bypass identity verification systems that required biometric confirmation or in-person authentication. Over the weekend, I received automated notifications that multiple transactions were being held for additional verification. David was trying to access the money, but the banks were requiring confirmation that he was authorized to make these specific types of business-related transfers. The verification process required either my direct approval or in-person confirmation at the bank with additional identification. Since I was in Dublin and hadn't authorized these transactions, the money was effectively frozen. David called me Monday morning, his voice tight with frustration. "Emma, there's some kind of problem with the bank accounts. They're saying they need additional verification for the transfers we discussed." "What kind of transfers?" "The ones for the loan collateral. We talked about this. The money needs to be moved into specific accounts for the business loan structure." "I don't remember discussing moving money into business accounts." "Emma, that's what this whole arrangement was about. Using the house sale money as collateral for business investments. I explained all of this. You told me you needed temporary help with housing costs. You didn't mention anything about business investments or rental property. There was a long pause. Look, maybe I didn't explain every detail, but the principle is the same. We're using family assets to create financial opportunities that benefit everyone. How does your rental property business benefit me? Emma, you're going to get your money back, plus interest. This is an investment opportunity, not a gift. You're essentially becoming a partner in a profitable business venture. A business venture I never agreed to join. You agreed when you signed the power of attorney and authorized the house sale. I authorized you to handle loan negotiations for housing. I didn't authorize you to start a business with my money. The conversation escalated from there, with David becoming increasingly frustrated as I refused to authorize the additional transfers he needed. He'd structured his entire business plan around immediate access to my house sale money, and the delays were threatening his timeline for property purchases and business registration. Emma, you need to understand the bigger picture here. This isn't just about one house or one loan. This is about building generational wealth for our entire family. The kids' college funds, mom and dad's retirement security, your own financial future. This business model could support all of us. With my money, with our combined resources and my business expertise. Emma, you're good with money, but you don't understand real estate investment. I've been studying this market for years. I know how to make this work. Then use your own money to make it work. You know I don't have access to the kind of capital this requires. That's why family partnerships make sense. You have capital, I have expertise. We combine resources for mutual benefit. Mutual benefit would require mutual agreement. You did agree. Maybe not to every specific detail, but you agreed to the basic principle of family financial cooperation. The conversation continued for another 40 minutes, but it became clear that David genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. In his mind, family financial resources were naturally available for family business ventures, and my objections were based on misunderstanding rather than legitimate disagreement. He saw himself as an entrepreneurial visionary who was building wealth for everyone's benefit. He saw me as an overly cautious person who didn't understand business opportunities. What he didn't see was that I'd been planning for this conversation for longer than he realized, and I had financial resources he knew nothing about. After the call ended, I made another series of secure phone calls to financial institutions. But this time, I wasn't checking on my own accounts. I was checking on David's. 6 months ago, when I first started moving my own money into secure accounts, I'd also started monitoring David's financial activity. Not illegally or unethically, just the kind of monitoring that family members who share certain financial connections can do legitimately. David had forgotten that when he'd helped me handle Grandma Rose's estate, we'd established some joint financial connections for temporary convenience. Shared access to safety deposit boxes, coordinated beneficiary information. On certain accounts, linked contact information for estate management purposes. Most of these connections had been forgotten or ignored once the estate was settled. But they still existed in the financial system, creating legitimate channels for information access that David wasn't actively monitoring. Over the past 6 months, I'd been watching David's financial patterns, his spending habits, his account balances, his loan applications, and credit inquiries. I'd watched him accumulate debt, make increasingly risky financial decisions, and develop spending patterns that were unsustainable on his actual income. David was living significantly beyond his means, using credit and financial leverage to maintain a lifestyle that his employment couldn't support. The job loss hadn't created his financial problems. It had revealed problems that already existed. More importantly, I'd been watching the business entity he'd created for his real estate venture. The bank accounts, the credit applications, the financial planning documents he'd filed with various institutions. David's business model wasn't as solid as he believed. His projected income was optimistic, His expense calculations were incomplete, and his risk management was practically non-existent. He was planning to use my money to fund a business venture that had a high probability of failure. But he was about to discover that I'd been planning too. While David had been focused on gaining access to my house sale money, I'd been quietly gaining access to his business accounts. Not illegally, but through the same kind of legitimate family financial connections he'd been using to access my accounts. David thought he was the only person in our family capable of strategic financial planning. He was wrong about that, just like he was wrong about so many other things. On Tuesday evening Dublin time, I initiated a series of financial transfers that David wasn't expecting. Not from my accounts to his accounts, but from his accounts to places he definitely didn't want them to go. David had been playing a game where he moved my money without my permission. Now it was my turn to move his money without his permission. The difference was, I actually knew how to play this game. The first transfer happened at 2:17 a.m. Dublin time, which meant it was 6:17 p.m. in California when David's business checking account suddenly found itself $43,000 lighter. Not enough to trigger immediate panic, but enough to disrupt his carefully planned cash flow for the next phase of his real estate venture. I was sitting in my Dublin apartment with a cup of tea and my laptop, watching transaction confirmations appear in real time across multiple time zones. The financial connections David had forgotten about were more extensive than even I had initially realized. When we'd handled Grandma Rose's estate together, we'd established temporary joint access to various accounts for practical purposes. Most people would have closed these connections once the estate was settled, but David had been careless about financial housekeeping. The joint access meant I could see his account balances, transaction histories, and pending transfers. More importantly, it meant I could initiate certain types of transfers between accounts we'd previously linked for estate management purposes. David had never bothered to remove these authorizations because he'd never imagined I would have reason to use them. He was about to learn the cost of that oversight. The second transfer occurred 6 hours later, when David was probably having his morning coffee and reviewing his business plans for the day. Another $37,000, this time from his personal savings account into an investment fund he didn't know I had access to. The transfer appeared legitimate on both ends, routed through established financial channels with proper authorization codes. By the time David realized what was happening, I'd moved over $200,000 from various accounts he controlled into accounts he couldn't access. Not theft, because all the transfers were authorized through legal channels we'd established months earlier. Not fraud, because I was using financial connections David had created and maintained himself. It was exactly what he'd done to me, just more efficiently executed. David called me at what must have been a very inconvenient time for him, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "Emma, what the hell have you done? My accounts have been emptied. Somebody's stolen all my money." "That's terrible," I said calmly, setting down my teacup and opening my laptop to review the latest transaction confirmations. "Have you contacted your bank's fraud department?" "This isn't fraud, Emma. This was you. Somehow you've been moving money out of my accounts, and I want to know how, and I want it stopped immediately." "I'm not sure what you're talking about, David. I've been in Dublin working on consulting projects. I haven't had time to think about financial matters beyond my own business expenses." "Don't play games with me. The transfers are coming from accounts connected to Grandma Rose's estate. Accounts you have access to." "Oh, those old estate management accounts? I thought you'd closed those months ago. Leaving them open seems like poor financial security, especially if you're concerned about unauthorized access." There was a long pause while David absorbed the implications of what I'd just said. He'd accused me of stealing his money using accounts he'd failed to properly secure. He'd also just admitted that he knew exactly which financial connections had been used, which meant he knew these transfers were legitimate rather than criminal. "Emma, you can't just take money from my accounts because you're angry about the house. You mean like you took my house because you needed money for your business venture?" "That's completely different. I had legal authority to handle the property sale. What you're doing is theft. Actually, what I'm doing is using the same type of legal authority you used. Remember those estate management documents we signed? The ones that gave us temporary joint access to various financial accounts for administrative purposes? You used your legal authority to sell my property. I'm using my legal authority to manage assets connected to our joint financial arrangements. That's not what those documents were for. Isn't it? You told me the power of attorney was just for basic property management, but you used it to sell my house and fund your business. I'm using estate management authority for asset transfers between related accounts. Seems like the same principle to me. The conversation escalated from there, with David making increasingly desperate demands that I reverse the transfers immediately. He had business obligations, property deposits due, loan applications pending. His entire financial structure was collapsing because he didn't have access to the money he'd been counting on. Emma, this is my livelihood you're destroying. I have a family to support, kids who need stability, a business that could provide security for all of us. You can't just sabotage everything because you're upset about one property transaction. One property transaction? David, you sold my grandmother's house without telling me and used the money to start a business I never agreed to invest in. You've been treating my inheritance like your personal investment fund. I was creating opportunities for our entire family. This business model could have supported everyone's long-term financial security. Mom and Dad's retirement, the kids' education, your own future wealth. Instead of thinking strategically, you're being vindictive and short-sighted. What I'm being is protective of my own financial interests, just like you were being protective of yours when you decided to sell my house. Emma, if you don't reverse these transfers, I'm going to lose everything. The San Francisco property deal will fall through. The business registration will be canceled. Months of planning and preparation will be wasted. That sounds exactly like what happened to me when you sold my house without permission. David tried several different approaches over the course of that conversation. He appealed to family loyalty, reminding me of all the times he'd supported me and helped me throughout our lives. He appealed to practical logic, explaining how his business venture could benefit everyone if I would just trust his expertise. He appealed to guilt, describing how my actions were affecting Michelle and the children. None of it worked because I'd heard all these arguments before, just directed toward justifying his actions rather than criticizing mine. When emotional appeals failed, he tried legal threats. He would contact lawyers, file fraud charges, pursue criminal prosecution for theft and financial misconduct. He would involve our parents, extended family, anyone who could pressure me to return his money. David, I said when he finally paused for breath, you should definitely contact lawyers. I'd be very interested to hear their opinion about the legal implications of using power of attorney documents to sell property for undisclosed business purposes. I'd also be interested in their assessment of estate management authority and legitimate asset transfers between authorized accounts. Emma, you know what you're doing is wrong. What I know is that I'm doing exactly what you did, using legal authority to move assets without full consultation with affected parties. The only difference is that I'm not pretending this is for anyone's benefit except my own. That conversation ended with David hanging up on me, but it wasn't the last communication I received from him. Over the next week, I got calls from Michelle, my parents, Aunt Patricia, and even Uncle Jim, all of whom had heard various versions of the story and wanted to help resolve this family misunderstanding. The narrative David was spreading painted me as an unstable person who'd had some kind of emotional breakdown triggered by work stress and living abroad. He suggested I was acting irrationally, making impulsive financial decisions that were hurting the entire family. He presented himself as a concerned brother trying to help me recover from temporary mental health issues. It was a clever strategy that reframed his theft as responsible family intervention and my response as evidence of psychological instability. Instead of defending his decision to sell my house, he was expressing worry about my ability to handle financial stress while working overseas. Michelle called first. her voice gentle and concerned. "Emma, David told me about the money transfers. He's really worried about you. This kind of financial behavior isn't like you at all. Are you okay? Is the work stress in Dublin too much? Maybe you should come home for a while and we can all figure this out together." "I'm fine, Michelle. Working abroad has been great for my career, and I'm handling my financial affairs exactly the way I want to handle them." "But Emma, moving that much money so quickly, without talking to anyone first, it seems impulsive. David says you've never made these kinds of dramatic financial decisions before." "David's right. I've never had to protect my assets from family members before." "Protect your assets? Emma, David was trying to help you. The house sale was part of a larger plan to optimize everyone's financial situation. He wasn't trying to hurt you." "Michelle, did David tell you that the house sale was funding his real estate investment business? Did he mention that he's planning to purchase rental properties and generate income from my inheritance money?" There was a pause. He said, "It was a business partnership, that you would be getting returns on the investment." "Did I ever agree to be his business partner?" David said you'd discussed it and agreed to the arrangement." David said a lot of things that weren't true. My conversation with Michelle lasted over an hour, and by the end, I could hear doubt creeping into her voice. She'd been told that I was aware of and supportive of David's business plans, but the more questions I asked about specific details, the clearer it became that David hadn't been entirely honest with her about my level of involvement. "Emma," she said finally, "if you really didn't agree to any of this, then David made a serious mistake. But can't you work it out somehow? The kids are so excited about the move to San Francisco. David's been promising them their own rooms and a backyard to play in." "Michelle, David can still move to San Francisco. He just can't use my money to fund a business I never agreed to invest in." But without the capital from your house sale, he can't qualify for the loans he needs. Then he needs to find a different business model or different funding sources, just like I would have to do if someone took my money without permission." The call with my parents was less gentle. Dad was direct and disapproving, while Mom alternated between worry and frustration. They'd raised us to support each other through difficult times, and my actions seemed to violate fundamental family values about cooperation and mutual aid. "Emma," Dad said, "I don't understand what's gotten into you. David made a mistake with the timing and communication about the house sale, but his intentions were good. He was trying to create opportunities for everyone. Your response has been completely disproportionate. Dad, would you be okay if I sold your house without telling you and used the money to start a business?" "That's not the same thing. David had legal authority to handle the property transaction." "Legal authority I gave him for a completely different purpose." "Emma, the point is that this is family. We work together. We help each other. We don't try to destroy each other over financial disagreements." "I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I'm trying to protect my own financial interests from someone who is willing to take advantage of family relationships for business purposes." Mom's approach was more emotional. "Emma, you're hurting people who love you. David's children are asking why Aunt Emma doesn't want them to have a nice house. Michelle is crying because they might have to stay in that cramped apartment. Your brother is devastated that his own sister would sabotage his efforts to build a better life for his family. Mom, David sabotaged his own efforts when he decided to fund his business with stolen money." "It wasn't stolen, Emma. It was a family financial arrangement." "A family financial arrangement requires agreement from all family members involved." These conversations followed the same pattern. Family members who'd been given David's version of events, which emphasized my irrationality and his victimization. They wanted me to be reasonable, which meant giving David what he wanted and accepting that his actions had been justified by his good intentions. None of them seemed particularly interested in discussing the ethics of selling someone's property, without permission or using legal documents for purposes beyond their intended scope. After a week of these conversations, I decided it was time to provide my family with a more complete picture of the situation. I prepared a detailed email with documentation of everything that had occurred, including timelines, financial records, and copies of the legal documents David had used. The email went to my parents, Michelle, Aunt Patricia, and Uncle Jim. I included bank statements showing the house sale transaction, real estate records showing the below-market sale price, and business registration documents showing David's investment company and his plans for rental property purchases. Most importantly, I included the original power of attorney documents alongside the correspondence where I'd specifically requested limitations on David's authority, and David's responses confirming those limitations. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. David had exceeded his legal authority, misrepresented his intentions, and used my property to fund a business venture I'd never agreed to support. The responses to my email were revealing. Aunt Patricia called to apologize for getting involved without understanding the full situation. Uncle Jim sent a short message saying he'd been misled about the circumstances and wouldn't be contacting me again about family financial matters. My parents' response was more complex. They acknowledged that David had made serious errors in judgment, but they also expressed concern about the long-term damage this situation was causing to family relationships. "Emma," Mom said when she called, "what David did was wrong. I can see that now. But what you're doing in response is also causing a lot of pain. Can't you find a way to resolve this that doesn't involve destroying your brother's future?" "Mom, David's future isn't my responsibility. He made choices that created his current situation, and he can make choices to resolve it. But Emma, you have the power to fix this. You could return his money and work out some kind of fair arrangement." "About the house sale. I could, but why should I?" "Because he's your brother. Because family forgives mistakes and helps each other recover from poor decisions." "Did David forgive my mistake when I trusted him with legal authority over my property? Did he help me recover when his poor decisions cost me my grandmother's house?" The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but it became clear that my parents wanted me to be the one who compromised, apologized, and accepted financial loss for the sake of family harmony. David's actions were mistakes, but my response was a choice to prioritize money over relationships. Michelle's response was the most honest. She called 3 days after receiving my email, and her voice was different, sadder, but more direct. "Emma, I had no idea about most of what you sent me. David told me you'd agreed to the business partnership, that the house sale was part of a plan you'd developed together. He showed me documents, but now I realize they were just the power of attorney papers, not any kind of business agreement. Michelle, did you know about the rental property business before David sold my house? He'd mentioned investment ideas, but I thought they were just dreams, things he might do someday if he ever had enough capital. I didn't know he was planning to use your house sale as startup funding. What did you think was happening when he sold the house? He told me you'd decided you didn't want to deal with property management while you were working abroad, and that you'd asked him to handle the sale and help you invest the proceeds. He said it was your idea to combine resources for a family business venture. Michelle, I found out about the house sale through a bank alert. David never asked me about selling it, and he never mentioned any business partnership." There was a long pause. "Emma, I'm so sorry. I feel like I should have asked more questions, but David handles all our financial decisions, and I trusted that he was being honest with me about the arrangements with you. You're not responsible for David's choices, but I benefited from them. We used your house sale money for deposits and moving expenses. I let my kids get excited about a house we couldn't actually afford. I went along with plans that were built on something that wasn't real." Michelle's apology was genuine and painful to hear. She'd been manipulated just as much as I had, fed false information that made her complicit in David's scheme without realizing what was actually happening. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "I don't know. David says he can fix this, that he has other funding sources, but I don't trust his version of reality anymore. I don't know what's true about our financial situation or his business plans. Michelle, you should probably get independent financial advice. Someone who can review your actual situation without any connection to David's business ventures." "Emma, can I ask you something? Are you going to give the money back?" "I'm going to keep the money David took from my accounts, just like he kept the money he took from my house sale." "So this is permanent? The family split, I mean." "That depends on David. If he wants to rebuild trust and relationships, he can start by acknowledging what he did wrong and working to make things right. If he wants to continue claiming he was justified and I'm being unreasonable, then we probably don't have much to build on. What would making things right look like? Honest acknowledgement of what happened, genuine apology for violating my trust, and concrete action to repair the damage he caused. And if he did those things, then we might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship, but it would be different from what we had before." Michelle and I talked for another hour about practical matters. How to handle family gatherings, what to tell the children, how to navigate the social complexity of a family that was dividing along lines of financial disagreement and broken trust. The conversation was sad, but necessary. We were both recognizing that David's actions had created consequences that extended far beyond the immediate financial impact. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected email from David, not angry or demanding like his previous communications, but formal and carefully worded. "Emma, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I realize I made serious errors in how I handled the house situation. I should have been more transparent about my business plans and gotten your explicit agreement before proceeding with the sale. I also should have been more honest with Michelle about the nature of our arrangement." The email continued for several paragraphs, acknowledging specific mistakes and accepting responsibility for the consequences of his decisions. It seemed like the kind of apology I'd been hoping to receive. But the final paragraph revealed his actual purpose. "I'm hoping we can find a way to move forward that works for everyone. I've identified some alternative funding sources for my business venture, but they'll take time to develop. If you could return the money you transferred from my accounts, I could stabilize my current situation while I work on longer-term solutions. In exchange, I could arrange to purchase the house back from the current owners and return it to you." Even his apology was a negotiation. David was willing to acknowledge his mistakes if I was willing to fix the problems those mistakes had created. I didn't respond to his email. 3 months later, I received a Christmas card from Michelle. Inside was a family photo and a brief handwritten note explaining that they'd decided not to move to San Francisco after all. David's business venture had fallen through when he couldn't secure adequate funding, but he'd found a stable job with a medical device company in Los Angeles. They were staying in their apartment for now, saving money for a house they could actually afford. The kids were disappointed about not moving, but they were adjusting to the idea that plans sometimes change. Michelle didn't mention the money David had lost or the house he'd sold. She didn't ask about my life in Dublin or when I might be coming back to California. She just sent a Christmas card with a family photo, the kind of minimal contact that maintains connection without requiring resolution. I sent a card back with a photo of Dublin at Christmas time and a note saying I hoped they were all doing well. 6 months later, my consulting contract in Dublin was extended for another year. The work was challenging and rewarding, and I'd built professional relationships that were opening doors to opportunities across Europe. I found a larger apartment in a quieter neighborhood, with space for a small garden and a view of the mountains outside the city. I was building a life that felt entirely my own, funded by money that was entirely my own, in a place where my family relationships were a pleasant memory rather than a daily obligation. David never contacted me directly again, though I occasionally Heard updates through Aunt Patricia or family friends. He'd found stable employment and was working to rebuild his financial situation. Michelle had started her own small business, freelance graphic design work that she could do from home while caring for the children. They seemed to be creating a life that was sustainable and honest, built on their actual resources rather than borrowed money or family obligations. My grandmother's house had been purchased by a young couple with small children who were excited about the garden and the neighborhood schools. According to the real estate records I occasionally checked, they were taking good care of the property. The garden was being maintained, and they'd added a swing set in the backyard. Sometimes I thought about that house and what it had represented. Family history, security, connection to something larger than myself. David's actions had severed that connection permanently, but they'd also forced me to build something new. I was no longer the person who inherited my grandmother's house and all the family obligations that came with it. I was the person who'd learned to protect what mattered to me, even when that protection required difficult choices about family relationships. The money David had stolen from my accounts remained in investment funds where it was growing quietly, just like my grandmother's original trust fund. I'd learned to think about wealth the way she had, as something to be managed carefully over long periods rather than spent immediately on urgent family needs. David had taught me an important lesson about family financial relationships, though not the one he'd intended. He'd shown me that love and loyalty and shared history don't automatically translate into financial trustworthiness. But he'd also shown me that I was stronger and more resourceful than I'd realized. When faced with betrayal and manipulation, I'd been able to respond strategically rather than emotionally. I'd protected my interests without destroying anyone else's future. David could have rebuilt his business with different funding sources and honest partnerships. Michelle could have pursued her career goals without depending on stolen money. Their children could have grown up in a stable home, funded by their parents' actual income rather than their aunt's inheritance. All of these outcomes remained possible, just more difficult and time-consuming than the shortcuts David had attempted. I'd learned to distinguish between supporting family members and enabling their poor choices. I'd learned the difference between being generous and being taken advantage of. Most importantly, I'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish or vindictive. Sometimes protecting yourself requires disappointing people who expect you to prioritize their needs over your own well-being. In Dublin, I built relationships with people who knew nothing about my family history or my financial situation. People who valued me for my work, my conversation, my friendship, rather than my usefulness in solving their problems. It was a different kind of family, chosen rather than inherited, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. 2 years later, when I finally returned to California for a brief visit, I saw David at a coffee shop near our parents' house. He was sitting alone, working on a laptop, looking older but more settled than I remembered. We made eye contact across the cafe. He nodded politely and I nodded back. Neither of us approached the other for conversation. It wasn't hostile, just distant. The acknowledgement of two people who'd once been close but had discovered they wanted different things from life and relationships. I finished my coffee and left, walking past the street where our grandmother's house used to anchor our sense of family geography. The neighborhood looked the same, but my relationship to it had changed completely. I was no longer the granddaughter who'd inherited a house and all the expectations that came with it. I was a successful international consultant who'd learned to build security on her own terms. David had tried to use family connections to fund his version of financial success. Instead, he'd taught me that real security comes from resources and relationships you can trust completely. And the only person I could trust completely with my financial future was myself. The notification came through at 6:30 a.m. Dublin time, on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Not a bank alert this time, but an email from a law firm in San Francisco with the subject line, "Urgent, regarding David Chen and Chen Properties LLC." I almost deleted it, assuming it was another attempt by David to pressure me through legal channels. But something about the sender's name made me pause. Morrison, Wells and Associates was a firm that specialized in corporate bankruptcy, not family disputes. I opened the email while my coffee was still brewing, standing in the kitchen of my Dublin apartment with morning light streaming through windows that overlooked a garden I'd been carefully tending for the past 6 months. The legal language was dense and formal, but the essential message was clear enough. David's real estate venture had collapsed completely, and there were criminal charges pending. The business model he'd built using my house sale money had involved more than just rental properties. According to the documents attached to the email, David had been operating what amounted to a sophisticated financial fraud scheme using investor money to purchase properties that were then leveraged for additional loans, with the proceeds used to fund lifestyle expenses rather than business operations. My house sale had provided the initial capital that made the whole scheme appear legitimate to subsequent investors. David had used the $250,000 from my property to purchase the San Francisco house, but instead of using it as a family residence, he'd immediately used it as collateral for additional business loans. Those loans had funded the purchase of 2 more properties, which were then used as collateral for even larger loans. Within 6 months, David had accumulated over $1 million in debt secured by properties worth half that amount. He'd been making payments on the various loans by recruiting new investors who thought they were buying into a profitable real estate business. Classic pyramid scheme structure, dressed up with legitimate-looking business documentation and family connections that provided social credibility. The scheme had collapsed when one of David's larger investors became suspicious about the promised returns and hired a private investigator to examine the actual financial records. What they found was a business with enormous debt, negative cash flow, and accounting practices that bore no relationship to the profitable enterprise David had been advertising. The investor had contacted other people who'd given David money, and within 2 weeks, they'd assembled enough evidence to file both civil lawsuits and criminal complaints. The FBI had seized David's business records, frozen his accounts, and begun investigating potential federal wire fraud charges. David was facing the possibility of significant prison time. I read through the legal documents twice, trying to understand how the situation had escalated so far beyond the family financial dispute I thought we were having. The David described in these court filings wasn't just someone who'd made poor decisions about family money. He was someone who'd been systematically defrauding investors for months, using increasingly sophisticated lies to cover up fundamental problems with his business model. The law firm was contacting me because my house sale had been identified as the initial funding source for David's fraudulent business operations. They wanted to determine whether I'd been aware of his intentions when I'd authorized the property transaction, and whether I might be considered a victim of his scheme or a potential accomplice. I spent the morning on international phone calls with lawyers, trying to understand my own legal exposure and what kind of cooperation would be required from me. The conversations were sobering and complex, involving questions about my knowledge of David's business plans, my authorization of the property sale, and my subsequent financial actions. The lawyers were particularly interested in my decision to move money from David's accounts after discovering the house sale. From their perspective, this could be seen either as legitimate self-protection by a fraud victim or as retaliation that might have contributed to the collapse of David's business and harmed other investors. Ms. Chen, the federal prosecutor, explained during one particularly difficult phone call, "We need to understand the timeline of your awareness about your brother's fraudulent activities. Did you know he was operating a pyramid scheme when you authorized him to sell your property?" "I didn't authorize him to sell my property at all. He used power of attorney documents for purposes beyond their intended scope." "But you did sign those documents, knowing they would give him significant financial authority." "I signed documents that were supposed to be limited to loan negotiations for housing. I specifically requested restrictions on the scope of his authority." "And when did you become aware that he was using your property sale money for business investments rather than housing costs?" About a week after the sale, when I started researching what he was actually doing with the money. And your response was to transfer money from his business accounts. My response was to protect my remaining financial assets from someone who'd just demonstrated that he was willing to steal from me. These conversations continued for weeks, with lawyers trying to determine whether my actions had been those of an innocent victim protecting herself, or someone with inside knowledge of David's fraud who'd acted to minimize her own losses while leaving other investors exposed. The distinction was legally significant. If I'd been an unwitting victim, my financial actions were legitimate self-protection. If I'd known about David's fraudulent business model, my decision to move money from his accounts might be seen as contributing to the collapse that harmed other investors. Eventually, the federal investigation concluded that I'd been deceived about David's intentions, just like his other victims. The power of attorney documents supported my claim that I'd intended to authorize limited property management, not business investment. The timeline showed that I'd discovered David's actual business model after it was already operational, not before. More importantly, the investigators determined that my financial actions hadn't contributed to the collapse of David's scheme. His business model was fundamentally unsustainable regardless of my participation or cooperation. He'd been using new investor money to pay returns to previous investors while funding personal expenses, a structure that would have collapsed eventually regardless of external factors. My decision to protect my own assets had simply happened to coincide with the natural timeline of David's business failure, but clearing my legal name didn't resolve the emotional and family implications of what had happened. David wasn't just someone who'd made poor financial decisions or violated family trust. He was someone who'd been systematically lying to me, to Michelle, to our parents, and to complete strangers for months. The business plan he'd presented to our family as a legitimate real estate venture had been a carefully constructed fraud from the beginning. He'd never intended to operate a profitable rental property business. He'd intended to use family money to establish credibility, then recruit outside investors to fund an unsustainable lifestyle while creating the appearance of business success. Michelle called me 2 weeks after the criminal charges were filed, her voice hollow and exhausted in a way I'd never heard before. "Emma, I need you to know that I had no idea what David was really doing. The business documents he showed me, the financial projections, the investor presentations, all of it was fake. He'd been lying to me about everything for months. Michelle, I never thought you were involved in the fraud. But I was involved in spending the money. The house in San Francisco, the kids' new schools, the furniture and cars and family, vacations, all of it was paid for with money David stole from people who trusted him. You didn't know it was stolen. But I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered how we could suddenly afford things that had been impossible before. I should have insisted on understanding where the money was coming from." Michelle was facing a terrible situation. Everything she'd built her family's life around for the past year had been funded by fraudulent activities she'd known nothing about. The house would be seized to pay back investors. The cars would be repossessed. The children's schools would have to be changed when they could no longer afford the tuition. Worse, she was facing the social and emotional consequences of being married to someone who'd betrayed the trust of friends, family members, and business associates. People who'd invested money with David weren't just financial victims. They were people who'd known him personally, who'd trusted him because of his family connections and social relationships. "Emma, I don't know how to rebuild from this. Not just financially, but socially. Everyone we know feels betrayed by David, and by extension, by me. The kids' friends' parents invested money with David. Our neighbors, people from church, Michelle's co-workers, all of them lost money because they trusted us. Michelle, you're not responsible for David's choices. But I benefited from them. I lived in a house paid for with stolen money. I sent my kids to schools funded by fraud. I built relationships with people David was actively deceiving." The conversation continued for over an hour, and it became clear that Michelle was dealing with consequences far beyond financial loss. She was facing the complete destruction of her social world, her sense of security, and her ability to trust her own judgment about the person she'd been married to for 8 years. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm filing for divorce. I can't stay married to someone who's been lying to me about fundamental aspects of our life together. And I can't have my children growing up thinking this kind of behavior is acceptable." "How are they handling everything?" "Tyler keeps asking why Daddy can't come home, and I don't know how to explain fraud to an 8-year-old. Sophia doesn't understand why we have to move again, why she can't go back to her school, why all the nice things we had are being taken away." Michelle's situation was heartbreaking, but it was also clarifying. David's actions hadn't just affected his direct victims or immediate family. They'd created ripple effects that were destroying multiple lives, including the lives of people he claimed to love most. The criminal trial proceeded over the next year, while I continued my consulting work in Dublin. I was required to testify via video conference about my knowledge of David's activities and the circumstances surrounding the sale of my house. The testimony was difficult but straightforward. I explained the power of attorney documents, my understanding of their intended scope, and my discovery that David had used them for purposes I'd never authorized. David's defense strategy seemed to focus on portraying his actions as business mistakes rather than intentional fraud. His lawyers argued that he genuinely believed his real estate model would be profitable, and that his failure to disclose certain financial risks to investors was poor judgment rather than criminal intent. The prosecution presented a different narrative. They showed that David had been aware from the beginning that his business model was unsustainable, that he'd deliberately misrepresented the financial performance of his properties to investors, and that he'd used new investor money to fund personal expenses while telling those investors their money was being used for property acquisitions. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Bank records, email communications, business documents, investor testimonies, all of it painted a picture of systematic deception over an extended period. David was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing, but Michelle sent me a brief email afterward describing the scene. David had made a statement accepting responsibility for his actions and apologizing to the victims, but the apology had felt hollow and self-serving rather than genuine. He talked about making mistakes and poor decisions, but he never really acknowledged that he'd been lying to all of us for months, Michelle wrote. Even at the end, he seemed more concerned about managing his image than understanding the harm he'd caused. The civil lawsuits continued for another year, with various investors trying to recover their losses through asset seizures and legal claims. My house sale money was identified as part of the fraudulent scheme, but since I'd been classified as a victim rather than a conspirator, I wasn't required to return any of the money I'd recovered from David's accounts. The legal system had determined that my financial actions had been legitimate self-protection rather than participation in fraud. David's other victims would have to recover their losses through other channels. 2 years after David's conviction, I received an unexpected letter forwarded to my Dublin address. It was from David, writing from federal prison, and it was unlike any previous communication I'd received from him. "Emma, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you don't want to read this letter or respond to it. But I wanted you to know that I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, not just to you, but to everyone who trusted me." The letter continued for several pages, and for the first time, David seemed to understand the full scope of his actions and their consequences. He wasn't trying to justify his behavior or minimize his responsibility. He was acknowledging that he'd systematically betrayed people who'd loved and trusted him, and that those betrayals had caused lasting harm that couldn't be undone by apologies or good intentions. I told myself I was building something that would benefit our whole family, but that was just a story I used to justify taking things that didn't belong to me. I stole your house. I stole money from investors. I stole Michelle's ability to trust her own husband. I stole our children's sense of security. The letter went on to describe the therapy and counseling programs David had been participating in during his incarceration, his growing understanding of the psychological patterns that had led to his fraudulent behavior, and his recognition that rebuilding trust would require years of consistent, honest action rather than words. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I took from you and why my actions were so much worse than the financial mistakes I pretended they were. I read the letter several times over the course of a week, trying to determine whether it represented genuine insight and remorse or another attempt at manipulation designed to generate sympathy and support. Eventually, I decided it didn't matter. Whether David's remorse was genuine or calculated, whether his understanding was real or performed, my response would be the same. I had built a life that didn't depend on his apologies, his insight, or his redemption. I wrote a brief reply acknowledging that I'd received his letter and appreciated his acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. I didn't offer forgiveness or express interest in rebuilding our relationship. I simply confirmed that I was doing well and wished him success in his efforts to understand and change his behavior. It was polite but distant, the kind of response you might give to a former colleague who'd contacted you years after a professional disagreement. Civil, but not personal. David wrote back once more, a shorter letter expressing gratitude for my response and respect for the boundaries I'd established. He didn't ask for more communication or suggest future contact. He seemed to understand that our relationship, whatever it had been before, was permanently changed. Michelle and I maintained occasional contact through holiday cards and brief emails. She'd rebuilt her life slowly and carefully, focusing on providing stability for her children while pursuing her graphic design business. The divorce had been finalized, and she'd moved to a different city where her family's history with David's fraud wasn't common knowledge. "The kids are doing better," she wrote in one Christmas email. "They understand now that their father made very bad choices that hurt a lot of people, including them. It's been hard, but they're resilient, and we're building something honest and sustainable." She'd also mentioned that Tyler had started asking questions about financial responsibility and business ethics, wanting to understand how to make money in ways that helped rather than harmed other people. Sophia had become interested in gardening, partly because she missed the backyard they'd lost, but also because she liked the idea of growing things that belonged entirely to her. Both children were learning lessons about trust, honesty, and self-reliance that most people don't learn until much later in life. Difficult lessons, but valuable ones. My own life in Dublin had evolved into something I couldn't have imagined when I first arrived for the consulting contract. The work had expanded into a permanent position with opportunities throughout Europe. I'd purchased a small house with a garden where I grew vegetables and herbs, creating the kind of peaceful domestic space I'd always wanted. The house was entirely mine, purchased with money I'd earned through my own work, decorated according to my own preferences, maintained according to my own schedule. No family obligations, no shared decision-making, no concerns about someone else's financial schemes or emotional needs. It wasn't a lonely life, just a self-determined one. I'd developed friendships with colleagues, neighbors, and people who shared my interests in gardening, hiking, and international travel. Relationships built on mutual interest and compatibility rather than family obligation or financial convenience. Sometimes I thought about the family gatherings I was missing, the holidays and birthdays and ordinary Sunday dinners that had once formed the rhythm of my social life. There was loss in that absence, but there was also freedom from the constant, low-level stress of managing other people's expectations and emotions. I'd learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness was the feeling of being isolated even when surrounded by people who made demands on your time and energy. Solitude was the feeling of being comfortable with yourself and your choices, even when you were physically alone. 3 years after David's conviction, I received a notification that he was being released early for good behavior. I felt nothing, in particular, about this news. Not relief, not anxiety, not curiosity about his plans or concerns about potential contact. His legal debt to society was being satisfied according to the system's determination of appropriate consequences. His personal debt to the people he'd harmed was a separate matter that couldn't be resolved through incarceration or early release. I didn't contact him, and he didn't contact me. 6 months later, I heard through family connections that David had found work in construction, living in a small apartment, and apparently focused on rebuilding his life through honest labor rather than financial schemes. Michelle had mentioned that he'd asked about visiting the children, but she'd decided they weren't ready for that kind of contact yet. The information came to me third hand through Christmas cards and casual family updates, the kind of distant news you receive about people who used to be important in your life but no longer have direct connection to your daily reality. I was glad to hear that David seemed to be making genuine efforts to live honestly. But his rehabilitation wasn't something I needed to witness or support personally. Other people could decide whether to give him opportunities for redemption. I had built a life that didn't require his participation or approval. Sometimes, during quiet evenings in my Dublin garden, I thought about my grandmother and the house she'd left me. The physical property was gone, sold and resold, and now occupied by people I'd never met. But the real inheritance she'd given me wasn't the house itself. It was the understanding that security comes from building something slowly and carefully, over time, rather than from dramatic gestures or family connections or other people's promises. It was the knowledge that the most important thing you can own is your own good judgment and the strength to act on it, even when those actions disappoint people you love. Grandma Rose had taken 40 years to create the garden that had been the heart of her property. She'd planted trees she wouldn't live to see mature, established perennial flowers that would bloom for decades, built soil that would nourish plants long after she was gone. David had wanted to harvest the value of her work immediately, converting decades of careful cultivation into quick cash for his business schemes. He'd thought the house was just an asset to be leveraged rather than a legacy to be honored. In my Dublin garden, I was learning to think like my grandmother, planting things that would take years to reach maturity, building soil that would improve with time, creating beauty and productivity through patience rather than speed. I was also learning to think about relationships the same way, building trust slowly through consistent actions, creating connections based on mutual respect rather than convenience or obligation, investing in people who valued the same kind of honest, sustainable approach to life that I was trying to develop. The money David had stolen from me was growing quietly in investment accounts, managed by professionals who understood long-term wealth building rather than quick profit schemes. The money I'd recovered from his accounts was growing alongside it, all of it becoming part of a financial foundation that belonged entirely to me. I wasn't building wealth to fund other people's dreams, or to solve family crises, or to enable anyone else's poor decisions. I was building wealth to create options for myself, to fund my own dreams, to ensure that I would never again be vulnerable to someone else's financial manipulation. It was a different approach to money than the one I'd grown up with, where resources were naturally available for family needs regardless of who had earned them or what they'd intended to do with them. 5 years after leaving California, I realized I'd stopped thinking of Dublin as a temporary assignment or my house there as a placeholder until I returned to my real life. This was my real life, built according to my own values and priorities, funded by my own work, shared with people who'd chosen to know me rather than people who'd been obligated to love me. The consulting business had grown beyond what I'd imagined possible, with clients throughout Europe and projects that were both financially rewarding and personally meaningful. I was working on sustainable technology implementations that would improve environmental outcomes while creating economic opportunities for local communities. It was work that felt like building something valuable rather than just earning money, contributing to solutions rather than just managing problems. David's Fraud had taught me to be skeptical of people who promised quick solutions to complex problems, whether in business or in relationships. Real solutions took time, patience, and honest assessment of actual resources and capabilities. But the most important lesson hadn't been about skepticism or protection. It had been about the difference between supporting people and enabling them, between being generous and being taken advantage of, between family loyalty and personal responsibility. I'd learned that saying no to unreasonable requests wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary for maintaining relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. I'd also learned that the people who accused you of being difficult or unreasonable when you established boundaries were usually the people who most needed those boundaries to be established. David had called me difficult when I'd refused to authorize additional transfers from my accounts. My parents had called me stubborn when I'd refused to return his money. Extended family had suggested I was being vindictive when I'd declined to participate in efforts to help him rebuild after his conviction. All of these accusations had been attempts to pressure me into prioritizing their comfort over my own well-being, their version of family harmony over my legitimate need to protect myself from someone who'd proven he was willing to steal from me. Learning to recognize these pressure tactics had been as valuable as learning to protect my financial assets. 10 years after my grandmother's death, I received a letter from the law firm handling her estate. There had been additional assets discovered during a routine audit, investments that had been overlooked during the original estate settlement. I was entitled to receive approximately $50,000 that had been accumulating interest in forgotten accounts. The irony wasn't lost on me. My grandmother's financial sophistication had extended beyond what any of us had realized. Just like her wisdom about relationships and trust had proven more valuable than the physical property she'd left me. David had stolen a house worth $250,000. But in doing so, he'd taught me lessons about self-protection and financial independence that were worth far more than any inheritance. I used the additional inheritance money to establish a small scholarship fund for students studying sustainable technology, with preference given to applicants who'd overcome significant family or financial obstacles to pursue their education. It seemed like a fitting way to honor my grandmother's memory while creating something positive from the destruction David had caused. The scholarship recipients were young people who understood that building something valuable required patience, honesty, and the strength to make difficult choices when family expectations conflicted with personal integrity. They were people who'd learned early in life that security comes from your own efforts rather than from other people's promises, that trust must be earned through consistent actions rather than assumed because of family relationships. In Dublin, surrounded by the garden I'd been cultivating for years and the career I'd built through my own work, I realized I'd finally created the kind of life my grandmother had tried to teach me to value. A life built slowly and carefully, with deep roots and the strength to weather unexpected storms. A life that belonged entirely to me, funded by my own efforts, shared with people who'd earned the right to be part of it. David's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had also been liberating. It had forced me to discover resources and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, to build independence I might never have developed if I'd remained comfortable within family support systems that came with hidden costs. Sometimes the most valuable thing someone can take from you is your illusion that they would never take anything at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them.
Out!